This week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast is sponsored by Artbase. Are you managing an art collection, an artist studio, or a gallery? Is it time to bring your collection management skills up to a professional level? We think so. Well, Artbase is the right software to manage your art business. Artbase allows you to track your artworks and contacts in an easy-to-use, powerful database. You just enter your data once and use that data to generate reports, offers, contracts, and much more. They've got a brand new version out with a whole new look that can be used on the cloud from any location on any device. So what are you waiting for? Go to artbase.com now to learn more and be sure to mention ArtTactic for a 15% discount. Over the past 12 years, the ArtTactic Podcast has grown to be a leading art market podcast. Each week we share an exclusive in-depth interview with a key art world insider. As we move into a new phase of programming, we want our broadcast to be listener-supported and create content that you want to hear, not what we think you want to hear. You can support us by visiting contribute.to/ArtTactic. Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. NFTs, NFTs, NFTs. They seem to be everywhere. Artists are making them, auction houses are selling them, the press is covering them. We've touched on them some on the podcast, of course, but ArtTactic just published a brand new NFT Art Market Report, and I told our founder and managing director, Anders Petterson, that he had to come on the podcast to tell us what motivated him to launch this report, as well as share some of his key findings. While NFTs have received a lot of attention, I think there has been a lot of focus on headlines and the kind of nuanced analytics perspective that the report provides makes it a lot clearer as to what exactly is going on in the NFT space on both the macro and micro level. You can download the NFT Art Market Report right now by visiting arttactic.com, and if you enter the promo code NFT Podcast 2021, you can save 30%. That code is NFT Podcast 2021. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks so much for downloading and listening. Anders, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be on.
Absolutely. So I remember we had a lot of internal discussions when NFTs really started gaining some traction about if and when ArtTactic should start covering them and potentially produce a market report. And so now we have a new NFT Art Market Report that's available to download at arttactic.com. So tell us what ultimately persuaded you to start covering NFTs at ArtTactic and produce a report such as the one we've just released.
So I guess our curiosity around the whole sort of space around NFTs started, I guess, initially around sort of 2017 to 18 with the sort of the rise of CryptoKitties and CryptoPunks. I think at that point we were, I would say, probably more sort of tangentially interested in seeing, what overlap could that have with the art world. But it was really, was exactly 12 months ago, end of November 2020, where we sort of started to sort of think, okay, is this a space that would be worth looking at from a research point of view? And obviously ArtTactic and the thing we're doing in terms of research is to find new research domains that we believe will have an impact on the art world, whether it's, when we started working with Deloitte and Art and Finance 10 years ago, when we started to look at the online art market with Hiscox also around 10 years ago. All these things are really when we're starting to see the emergence of something that could have an impact. And that's really what we've started to feel, I would say, strongly towards the end of last year and the early parts of this year. So it was, I would say, it's a kind of an evolution where I wanted to, for the companies in terms of relevance, is to ensure that we gather and collect and analyze data that is useful for our stakeholders, which is really the art market as a whole. And I think this is the importance for us to study the NFT market, maybe slightly differently from other kind of studies and analytics that is now produced on the NFT market, which is largely volume driven and transaction driven. We wanted to kind of take a slightly different look to try to dissect this market, to try to understand the overlaps between the more traditional art world as we know it and this new market that is evolving. And so our interest still remains very much, I would say, from an art market point of view, but what could NFTs and what could this market and the technology mean for the art market in the future? So that was the kind of the starting point. I'd say, like anything, curiosity, and then starting to build up a data set and several data sets that we have now, kind of really focusing around one platform initially, which was NFT Gateway, which just allowed us to have data for about a couple of year period, just to, obviously this is a short space in time, but a lot of things has happened in a very short, just a short number of months before the market has really taken off, particularly this year, March reaching the kind of the first peak, and then subsequently we've seen an evolution into the autumn where another peak was reached in August, and the market has changed, the dynamic is changing. So this is really the kind of the purpose, as I said, is to start to gather intelligence and data for us to be relevant and help the art world to think about what should one do and how should we tackle this issue regarding NFTs, and should we get involved or should we not? So we're still very much, as I think, in the exploratory phase, and relatively, obviously, this is a new sort of territory for us.
Yeah, I think this kind of report is really important for the NFT space, which is still very much in its nascent stages. I feel like the NFT area is lacking in two critical areas. One is this kind of market analysis, right? Using big data to inform market participants. And then also, I think there seems to be a dearth of curators who can provide curatorial direction. And so I think if we see more of these two things in the near future, that will go a long way when it comes to ensuring the longevity of NFTs. So this is the second iteration of the NFT Art Market Report, actually, and this report focuses on the artists and creators of NFTs. And we read a lot about incredible prices for NFTs, but I'm wondering, is it a small group of artists who are thriving, or is it quite expansive? And who are some of the leading artists that we do highlight in the report?
Again, we sort of used the NFT Gateway as our sort of test sample to see, really the kind of demographics and gender and age and so forth, just to kind of do it a bit of a study. Obviously, this is not necessarily, obviously it's not covering every single NFT under the sun, but it gives us an insight, I think, into the dynamics of it. So I think, first of all, there's, in terms of the dynamic of the market, you typically have a sort of a sense of, a winner takes all market. There is a relatively small number of 5% of the artists will account for roughly just under 60% of, the total sales. If we took a quarter of the artists, then basically 90% of the sales will be accounted for by these artists. So there's a quite a diversity in terms of number of artists. They come from different backgrounds. A lot of it is not kind of over traditional, from the art world point of view, the traditional art market, but comes from the creative sector, some from the music, some from gaming community, from the design community. And I think is interesting is that many of these artists were totally new for the traditional art world. I mean, these were, the likes of Beeple. Now, obviously, this is now a name that everyone will are aware of, partly because of the 69 million transaction he had at Christie's in March this year. But you have Pac, you have Mad Dog Jones, Trevor Jones, Grimes is involved. There's a lot of these names that has been known, obviously, they have massive communities built around them, but not the traditional art world. And I think this is kind of maybe the interesting thing now is that these communities are very different from the traditional art world. And I think, part of what we've seen with Sotheby's, Christie's and Phillips is that, tapping into this NFT market is also to build relationship, I guess, with this, largely kind of crypto community that is, has an amazing growth, and also you've seen the spending power of that community over the last 6-7 months. But in terms of if you look at the underlying sort of the nature of these artists, as I said, there's relatively, there's a sense that NFTs are sort of this democratic medium that, this is an opportunity for everyone to succeed. I think, unfortunately, like we've seen also with things like social media, etc., there's a relatively few number of people that can, amass large following and audiences. And the same thing, I think, here in the NFT world, there are a relatively small number of artists that are very successful. And they kind of, it's a very skewed market. And then you will see that there was a lot of people that, probably will be, make a decent living out of this, but probably not, and others will not at all. So I think at the moment there is this, as I said, this sort of winner takes it all. I think it's a sort of, at least from the sample that we look at the moment, seems to be the case. Whether that changes in the future, that is possible. I think it's interesting, obviously, from a demographic point of view. There's younger artists. I mean, millennials and Gen Z will account for 61% of sales, which is I think it's a great thing. So obviously, NFT market is bringing younger artists, younger creatives, younger talents into the market, creating new markets for these artists that might not have been there otherwise, which I think it's a positive thing. Also the sample that might be a little bit to do with the platform's own location, which is a US-based company that, North America accounts for, the lion's share of the market with 60%. Britain has about 13% in terms of the artists where they come from. Whilst, markets like emerging markets that there's a lot to talk about, for example, Africa, in terms of the traditional art market, Latin America and so forth. But these two markets would only account for about 4% of the artists. So there's also kind of a lack of diversity at the moment within the artist space, and the creative sector really dominated, I would say, predominantly by Europeans or North Americans and Europeans. And the gender issue, as many of maybe our listeners would have kind of caught up in the media the last few weeks, is again, there's a significant male bias at the moment. We have female artists account for about 5% of total sales. They are about 16% of the in terms of number of artists, which again shows these unfortunately the kind of the skewness in terms of gender in this market, which I think it's an important part to maybe start to be aware of and to try to rectify, because I think if we're going to start to build a new ecosystem around NFTs going forward, it's important that we make sure that's diverse in terms of race, gender, age, and so forth, in order to make sure that many of these I would say these discrepancies and these biases that are currently appearing in the market is not going to be stuck there forever. It is easy when certain people are, I think artists are successful, is that this kind of just reproduces itself, and suddenly we are left. The more powerful the market becomes, many of these biases will not go away. So I think it's important now at this early stage of the NFT market is to try to address these things, and particularly for many of the curated platforms is the choice that they have in terms of accepting or focusing and inviting female artists, artists of color, and so forth, making sure that they are represented on these platforms. So I think in the sense that this report was really, rather than looking at the amazing prices that's been achieved in NFTs, was maybe start to take a little bit of a critical look at the ecosystem and how it currently behaves and how it looks like, so that we can at this early stage maybe start to kind of question it and say, do we really want this market to be like it is today, or is there something we can do for the future to ensure that we don't fall into the same trap as we have done in many other markets?
That 5% figure, it's really stunning. The traditional art market's been dealing with this gender gap issue for a very long time, and I recall, I think according to our latest art market report, there's actually been significant progress made there finally. Yeah, this gender gap that we identified in the report has been heavily picked up by the press, and it's an important issue that needs to be tackled. How big of an issue do you think this is right now, and is it being addressed in any meaningful way within the NFT community?
I think these things will be addressed, and I think there was at the same time last week when we reported about this gender gap and the ethnicity and race aspect, or where art is coming from. I think there was also projects happening in the African continent. There's definitely things going to happen. So I think in a sense there may be these projects are, I think people are maybe increasingly aware of the fact that we reported it. I don't think it's necessarily that no one knew about it. I think people already had a sort of a sense that this was the case. And I believe that these things will be rectified. As I said, we are still at the very nascent stage of this market emerging, and I think it goes so fast and it develops so quickly that from one week to the other the market looks potentially totally different. So I think again, the purpose of this report was just to stop and ask ourselves, okay, what does this market look like, and bring out some of the key characteristics, and some of them aren't very positive, but I think it's not too late to change these things, and I think people it will happen. And I ultimately, I think also the crypto community and the crypto world maybe already has a very sort of male dominated aspect to it, which maybe has kind of filtered through into the market aspect. But I think as this market mature, hopefully, as you say, the more curatorial aspects comes into the market more in the way things are selected, rather than a kind of an open structure, will allow for creatives from different backgrounds, from different gender, to come into this market and try to kind of, as you say, a little bit like we've seen in the younger, particularly in the younger part of the contemporary art market now, where female artists has a much more presence that they had in the past. So I think this will happen. I'm seeing small signs of this happening already. So I think as I said, with the sort of the pace and the speed of this market, I think many of these things can be addressed relatively quickly. But it's just, I think, is like anything, it's important to be aware of this. It's very easy to kind of fall into a kind of a trap of tracking, prices and volumes and sales and the next big thing, without potentially asking yourself, what's behind this, or who are the creators, where did they come from? So yeah, so I think these things will. I'm hopeful that these things will be addressed going forward.
I hope so too. It'll just take a little bit more time in reporting like this that shines a light on it. I do want to ask you about how much crossover we're seeing right now between the traditional art world and NFTs. Anecdotally, I'm noticing some art collectors who are dipping their toes in and acquiring one or two NFTs. And then I'm seeing some other collectors who are focused on NFTs created by traditional fine artists. And then I'm seeing a lot of art collectors who just aren't embracing NFTs, really. What are you seeing in terms of crossover?
Yeah, we're about to start to go out with a survey in the next week to actually look at this space in terms of how the traditional art market views NFTs and to what extent sort of the involvement. And I think, again, for me, it's becoming also a little bit anecdotal rather than sort of research based. I think there's an hesitancy to embrace NFTs at the moment among the more traditional. I think there is a slight difference, with a sense, among younger collectors that finds this quite refreshing. I think they find the technology and the opportunities that the technology can present as something that is of interest. I think maybe at the moment some of these younger individuals might lack the means to participate. I think NFTs, had it been 4 or 5 years ago, you could probably pick these up at relatively affordable levels. Now, prices it's become a very, very speculative marketplace, and often, I think it's hard sometimes to try to understand the actual value behind these things. And I think it's often caught up in speculation, manipulation, FOMO, all of these things, which I think even young people are kind of slightly afraid of jumping on the bandwagon. So, but I do think, I do sense, at least from the kind of discussions we have, I think there's really maybe from older generational collectors a bit more hesitancy in regarding whether this is anything they really want to get involved in at all. But from the younger ones, I do sense at least a sense of curiosity, and I think what we see now, I think just generally from a technology point of view, I think NFTs are, we still, as I said many times, we're in the sort of the early stages of a marketplace. I think many of the things and many of the NFTs that we see today might not have the value that they have today. But and even if this will be a kind of a boom frenzy followed by a deep correction in the market, I think the technology itself has opened up and is opening up for significant, huge possibilities, both in the sort of digital collectible space, but also potentially between the physical art world and the sort of digital, in terms of between the physical object and the NFTs itself. I mean, whether we're talking about NFTs as digital title ownership certificates for physical art, whether every single artwork, physical object has a digital twin. Maybe for the first time we can start to envisage a global title registry for artwork, and maybe NFTs in the sense has become the gate opener for that to happen. Many of these discussions has been ongoing for 5-6 years about the role of blockchain as a provenance tracking title registry, and maybe in a sense the what's happened over the last 12 months in a sense is open up the art world's interest in the technology itself. So I think regarding the art, I think we've gone through probably different reiterations and different sort of cycles. But I think through every single cycle, there's a legacy being left in every cycle that the next cycle will build on. And I think we were just at the very, very beginning of seeing what the potential it has. And I think it can have. Already we have seen what NFTs can create in terms of a marketplace, what it can do to creatives in terms of creating new revenue streams, and maybe dealing with some of the inequities that we see in the art world. So I'm really positive about it. And I'm coming back to whether, existing collectors, I think there's, like anything in the art world, I think the art world is relatively traditional and resistant to change. We have seen that in the online art market for ages, to how long it actually took for the art world to properly embrace online, and it had to almost be the advent of the pandemic last year that kind of forced and became a kind of a catalyst for the art market to really embrace online. I think the whole thing with NFTs is almost like one step further than the online, but I think many of the kind of the hurdles and challenges that the move to online created initially, that has been broken down. I think it also has paved the way for the traditional art world to be more open to technological change, innovation, and NFTs will be part of that. So my feeling right now, and as I said, we were about to go out with a new survey to look at this, to see whether to what extent is the traditional art world interested, has been looking at or have done anything in the NFT world so far, or will do in the future. I think my gut feel at the moment is I think there's a little bit of sort of sitting on the fence, but I'm sure that will change going forward.
And so the final question I have for you is, are NFTs here to stay? Of course, no one really knows the answer to this, and I vacillate often about it. Sometimes I think they're certainly going to stay. Other times I think about just the economy that we're in right now. It's so inflated. There's so much liquidity. We're seeing so many assets trading at or near all-time highs, and we're seeing NFTs really flourish in this economic boom. And I wonder what happens if there is some kind of correction. But do we take a position on this at ArtTactic in terms of NFTs and if they're here to stay? Does any of the data that we've reviewed provide us with any hints to answer this question?
Well, I think it will probably be more speculative, but I think there's a kind of distinction between maybe the NFT as a technology and NFT art, which sometimes is kind of muddle up and maybe a little bit. We see the technology of NFT and the opportunities that NFTs can provide for the ownership of any digital assets. It could be, not necessarily art or collectibles. It could be other types of digital assets out there, from other creative industries like music and so forth, films. But I think the NFT NFTs as a technology, I think this is here to stay. I don't think and it might evolve, and maybe in 5 to 10 years time, we won't even call it an NFT, which is call it something totally different, but it was ultimately built on the principles of what we see today. And in many ways, maybe NFTs will be the kind of the infrastructure that sits behind many collectibles, being digital or non-digital or in physical form, becomes the infrastructure for how we trade, how we transfer ownership from one to the other. a little bit the way that we don't really necessarily talk about internet now when we book a flight, or we transfer money from your bank account to someone else's. I mean, the internet is the kind of the infrastructure behind it, and this is really where I see NFTs more as the infrastructure rather than the actual output. And I think what comes out in terms of the creative aspects at the moment, I think that's a massive amount of creative output, and some it's hard to decipher whether the quality is there to sustain and to remain forever. And I think there probably will be a lot of volatility and a lot of ups and downs in terms of prices and values related to digital collectibles. But ultimately, I think our position on NFTs is that NFTs is here to stay, whether it's in this form or an evolved form. I think it's going to be an infrastructure. It's going to be, as I said, a little bit like the internet and what it has done for us as a society and an economy, etc. NFTs, I think, is just one part of that new ecosystem that is now evolving around, Web 3.0 and metaverses and all these things, which size, sounds very science fiction, but I think, we're not that far off. Sotheby's has already moved itself into the metaverse through Decentraland. Facebook has just, announced their ambition regarding the metaverse, and they've changed their group's name to Meta. So I think, we are at the kind of cusp of, I don't think anyone really knows what that next stage might look like. But I think, as I said, I think the NFT and the technology behind it is something that will outlast, maybe many of the more kind of speculative aspects that we discussed earlier.
It'll be very interesting to see how all this plays out, and we'll certainly be covering NFTs moving forward. Anders, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and sharing some of the insights from our brand new NFT Art Market Report, which is available to download right now on ArtTactic.com. And our listeners can save 30% off the report right now by entering the promo code NFT Podcast 2021 at checkout. That's NFT Podcast 2021. Anders, thanks again for joining us, and we'll speak to you soon.
That's great, Adam. Thanks a lot, then.
We want to thank ArtBase for sponsoring this week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast. Are you managing an art collection, an artist, studio, or gallery? Is it time to bring your collection management skills up to a professional level? Well, ArtBase is the right software to manage your art business. ArtBase allows you to track your artworks and contacts in an easy-to-use, powerful database. All you do is enter your data once, and you use that data to generate reports, offers, contracts, and a bunch more. They've got a brand new version out with a whole new look that can be used in the cloud from any location on any device. So go to artbase.com now to learn more, and be sure to mention ArtTactic for a 15% discount.